Let me record. Great. So, welcome everyone. So, I'm excited, or if I say I am, we are excited to have you back for process and people management. And, if I say that they both, if I say our argument today is, that they require the same attention. And if I say it's kind of leading from last session where we talked about the hero, right? The person that takes everything on. So we looked at that person, and now we're looking at it from a, I say, bigger perspective. Process and people management require the same attention, so don't prioritize one over the other. Arjen, what do you want to add before we get going?
Yeah, I think that uh, very often it's underestimated, either the people dimension or the process dimension, but these two need to work in conjunction. The process needs to be able to actually help people to be successful and not the other way around, whilst people should not be there to do things outside of the process then it becomes an inefficiency. And the only thing where they really need to be outside of the process is when something unexpected happens. And we talked last week about heroes. Well, working based on the process doesn't mean you don't need heroes, but you need them for the actual big fires and not just for the small kitchen fires anymore. And
Yeah.
that's what I believe we're going to talk about today, bridging the first one up into the second one and making them both equally important. So let's kick it off and have an enjoyable session.
Because it's a management issue about attention, control, and value at the end of the day, right?
Yeah,
So
correctly.
let's get going. Let's excuse me. Let's start with a short introduction. I mean, most of you already know us anyway, but so I'm Volker Ballueder. I'm an executive coach. Do a lot of trainings on leadership development, particularly in the age of AI. Coach people around that topic. Yeah, and that's probably all I need to say. I mean, if you're interested, look me up on LinkedIn, connect with me on LinkedIn. There's a lot of stuff I'm doing all the time. New events, new cohorts coming. Teaser alert. So yeah, over to
Yeah,
you.
nice. And I'm Arjen van Berkum. I am what's called the wizard in CAT CM, and I'm purely focused on how to actually make contract management work. And I publish and I research a lot about this. But hey, like Volker, I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there. So let's kick it off.
Yeah, let's make it less about us and more about the content. So I think, other than last time, we I do a few slides now in a row, so we don't have to swap as often. That was a bit of feedback we got. So on paper, it works, right? That's what we often hear from senior leaders, and it's very, if I say, senior leaders is a very confident description of how contract management works in organization, right? So it works on papers, senior management is there. There's a system, right? Contracts go through approval, milestones are tracked, risk is reviewed, and on paper, it all sounds hunky-dory, all structured, sensible, under control. And to be fair, in many organizations, those things actually do exist, right? We keep forgetting it. The process, capable people, tools, reports. But this is where we need to make an important distinction. There's a big difference between something running and something running well, right? So you probably guess where I'm leading here, because a function can appear calm, orderly, and dependable from the outside, while underneath it is being held together by effort that leadership never really sees. So people are chasing updates manually. They're filling gaps between teams. They're spotting risks early and dealing with them informally. They're making sure deadlines are not missed, obligations are not forgotten, and issues do not escalate. So, from a leadership perspective, looking into the process, the silence can look like evidence that the system is healthy. But often that silence is not a sign of control. It's a sign that someone is working very hard to absorb friction on behalf of the organization. And that matters because when leaders only see the surface, they naturally assume the process is functioning as intended. They see activity and they read that as performance. They see stability and they read it as control. But again, this visible order does not always mean underlying strength. So the point really here is not that leaders are careless or indifferent. In most cases, the blind spot does not come from bad intent, it comes from distance. The further you're from the operational reality, the easier it is to confuse the existence of a process with the effectiveness of a process. And that is the gap we want to explore today, the gap between what leadership believes is happening and what people in the function are actually doing to keep things moving. And usually, coming back to the last webinar, right? People holding it together is often the silent heroes, right? And that's where it all comes together. So if we're looking at sustained inattention, right? Failure is rarely dramatic at first. More often, the first failure is much quieter, right? It is a fact that contract management is typically positioned as a support infrastructure, right? And you all know what I'm talking about here. It is seen as necessity, of course, but not usually as a strategic priority. It sits in the background while leadership attention goes elsewhere. Revenue, product, growth, to the issues that feel more visible and more commercially immediate. And that creates a problem because the absence of attention is not neutral. Over time, it becomes a form of risk creation. Because if a function is important enough to protect value, manage obligation, reduce exposure, and support delivery, then it is also important enough to deserve leadership attention before something goes wrong. You would think so anyway. But in many organizations, that attention only arrives when a contract misses value, when a dispute appears, when a renewal is lost, or when a delivery issue becomes too visible, or too visible to ignore, basically. And by then, leaders are no longer managing conditions early, they're responding to consequences late. Again, they become reactive rather than being proactive. And I think that is the important distinction on this slide. So the issue is not that leaders need to become experts in every clause, every process step, or every detail. The point is that they need to stay engaged with the conditions under which the function operates. Is the process still fit for how the business works today? Are responsibilities clear? Are the risks visible and visibly early enough as well? And do the people in the function have the authority, context, and support they need? Because if leadership attention is absent for too long, small weaknesses stop isolating weaknesses, which means they begin to accumulate. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. And eventually what looks like well-functioning support process turns out to be a risk that was quietly grown in plain sight of the leadership. So one more slide, I think, and then hand over to you. But what this slide is really showing here now is a set of precise measurements. So in most organizations, certain things are reviewed repeatedly and with real discipline. Financial performance is tracked obviously closely. Sales pipeline, I know that from my own experience, right, gets regular attention. Product issues are discussed quickly. And those areas attract the leadership energy because they're seen as strategic, visible, and directly connected to performance and revenue, right? That's why sales always gets attention. But contract management often sits somewhere different. It's expected to function in the background. It's assumed to be stable. It is assumed to be under control unless something goes wrong. And that creates a specific problem. Because if financials, pipeline, and product are reviewed routinely, but contract performance is only examined after miss, then what you have built is a reactive system by default. Coming back to my earlier point, right? Reactive leadership. So the organization is not really managing contract performance as in a forward-looking way. It is waiting for failure, a delay, a missed renewal, a value gap, or risk event before the attention shows up. And by that point, leadership is no longer shaping conditions early. It is responding late. So it's the imbalance, and the imbalance tells us something important about management behavior. What gets regular scrutiny improves, and what stays in the background quietly deteriorates. And contract management is especially vulnerable to that because deterioration is rarely dramatic at first. It happens through small missed signals, outdated assumptions, and issues that do not look urgent until they suddenly are. So the question I would leave you with on this slide is a simple one. Where does contract management sit in your own leadership rhythm today? Is it something you review as part of performance and delivery? Or is it something you mainly hear about when problems have already surfaced? I have the feeling it's the latter. But that's enough about me, or from me. And do you want to take over?
Yeah, definitely. And although you have, of course, already said a lot of very smart things about what's actually happening, and you have talked about the fact that failure is something that really happens over time. It usually doesn't arrive in a big bang, but it builds up and then all of a sudden it explodes. So you can almost look like like a balloon that you keep on blowing up, and then all of a sudden, when you think you're still blowing up the balloon, it says bang, kabang, so to say.
Yeah.
Then what you also then already said, and I think that's also pretty important, because it has turned into such a reactive function, such a reactive process, it usually means that you only see the small incidents, but you don't see the fact that these incidents actually are a signal of a bigger problem. If we take a jump into something completely different, let's call it the ITIL way of thinking, if you have your issue management and you understand your issues, then you can actually identify what the overarching problems are, and therefore you can improve the system. But if the information is scattered and there's no structure in how to exchange this information across the organization, what you will tend to end up with is actually a lot of people saying, yeah, but we already knew that. But then the same mistakes keep on happening again. So that means that all these small incidents are then being ignored. The big incidents, of course, are being seen, and they usually then require like almost silverback attention from the top gorilla that's saying, fix it now. Whilst at the same time, actually, it should have never reached the desk of the silverback. It should have been fixed way earlier, and it should have been seen, and actually, it should have been prevented. And that's what also when we talk about that leaders see the final symptom, is they see the accumulated um, errors, they see the accumulated problems, um, and then they need to act. They need to understand, and then they start asking questions. How did this happen? Where did it happen? Didn't we see it? Why didn't we see it? Who's to blame? Because that's then also one of the other questions that always turns around. While in the end, this is not about being part of the blame game. This is about understanding that this is a process that manages not your past performance, it manages your future performance. Because yes, all these KPIs and SLAs and XLAs and whatever you have to measure performance and to see how your counterparts are doing actually won't get you to change the past. But you can use the past to make sure that you actually see something happening towards the future. And this is then also, I think, what is the human behavior side of this, is we need to learn people that these kind of roles are not there because they're administrative or part of the compliance police or accountancy or whatever. No, this is a cross-functional process. Therefore, it requires people that have the ability to work cross-process and therefore have the ability to talk with every single silo and to understand what each silo wants. HR, finance, the business, control, audit, you name it. All these silos are part of this cross-functional process. And it means that contract management as a process is not a procurement process. It's not a sales process. It's a human-centered process that will help you manage future um, stability. So yeah, failure is gradual. It's usually administrative. It's easy to say, this is not a big thing. And then when all these things pile up, you have a problem. But then the problem is usually isolated in a silo. But if you're willing to break the silo by connecting them, which is something else than killing the silo, means building the bridges, then actually this function becomes really relevant in managing your long-term continuity, your long-term stability. But that then also means that the people that are in this function should not be the people you have left over from the last reorganization. These should be the people that really understand how to drive your total value of your total ecosystem. So that was my shift to the process. Let's go to the next.
Yeah.
Because in the end, I always believe these small failures we discussed earlier are things people will see. And usually they will see them way before they end up in the spreadsheet or way before finance starts saying, hey, we have a problem. And for instance, value leakage. Most people already understand when a KPI is not going to be green. They usually see it coming up ahead. And then most of the time, their early warning signals are ignored. Why? Because it's an issue yet. There's nobody complaining, and the service levels aren't red yet. Yeah, but if we wait acting upon when it turns red, then we're too late. Then the second thing is what we see is that usually companies are fantastic in negotiation of stuff, but then the people on the shop floor actually do not know why certain clauses were there. So there's no ownership. Everybody touches the contract, nobody owns it. Nobody understands what it's about. So what then these contract managers tend to do is tend to, one, explain a lot, but also are get into the struggle that this happens at both sides of the table. So in the end, both sides are working on perceptions, and usually perceptions means lots of discussions and waste of energy, and also can lead to significant stress, where we talked about in the previous webinar. Then there's milestone management. The more and more and more we talk with each other, have all kinds of meetings without meeting minutes, therefore we don't have a process. Things are going to slip away into, yeah, but we said we were not going to make it, whilst in the end, you really want this to be managed and to be people on the front. But that means also that people need to transition from the fun part of fixing things to the fun part of making sure that nothing derails. And that means an attention, but especially also an attention by leaders to actually compliment those that never have issues, which is something completely else than saying to the hero, here's the Victoria Cross, you're a winner. But usually we should ask the question, why did they need to fight? Wasn't there a way to make sure that we didn't end up in a fight? And then it also turns into discipline. So system of record, yeah, to be honest, as I said earlier with meeting minutes, etc., process requires discipline, requires a way of working, not because there's a process, but because it makes the work more sustainable and gives us the ability to focus. It doesn't matter if I talk about meeting minutes or if I talk about performance analytics or talk about financial engineering, doesn't really matter. It's all about if you actually keep the stuff up to date and are on top of things, that means that you actually are not going to make mistakes. And one of the key mistakes that are being made, we see this, for instance, a lot in software, is that key renewals are missed, which means that you sometimes end up with a software package you actually weren't using, but you automatically renewed for the next 3 years for X amount of euros or pounds, which is a complete waste of time. So there's all these small and little failures. And to be honest, there will be dozens more from your practice that you have seen on the shop floor as well. And I think both Volker and I have seen them also as well. Is there's so much being missed that actually it ends up. So if you start skipping away from the small stuff, then actually the small stuff will become the big stuff. And all these things in here, and all these things that are in the back of our mind that we know, oh yeah, that's already there, that's already there, that's also happening, will actually turn into something like one cogwheel moves the next cogwheel, and then all of a sudden we have a whole system of cogwheels that are somewhere failing, and then it explodes. So these small failures are there, but these small failures require process, but they also require humans to actually oversee the process, understand where they need to act, and also have the mandate and the protection in order to act and to feel safe. So that's what I wanted to talk about on these small failures.
Great. No, I agree with most of them. I mean, if not all of them, of course. So this is still your slide here as well.
Yeah,
Curious
yeah, but
what you think about that one, because it kind of goes in line with what you just discussed, doesn't it?
yeah, definitely, and definitely. But I also wanted to make sure the audience didn't fall asleep because they were only listening to me. So once you decide that you need healthy process design, That means, yes, you need a clear process owner. Most organizations have product owners, but actually process owners that have the ability to go cross-functional, and contract management is a cross-functional process, it needs an owner. It also means that every process has its own continuous improvement, like a plan, do, check, act cycle. It doesn't need to be changed every week or something, but making a process and then saying this is the process for the next 5 years. Yeah, you could have done that when you were building T-Forts, but nowadays that's completely obsolete. Your process is also under continuous improvement, which means that this process should not only be there to make sure that everybody works in the same way and we don't have these small signals happening anymore, but it actually enables leadership to be in control. So when something unexpected happens, like closing down the Hormuz Strait or something that recently happened, or trade wars or other shocks to the system. That means that the leadership can give not only get the signals, but can also give the signal in order to what is that needs to happen. But that means named ownership. And named ownership for me is an individual, is not a group. Shared responsibility is no responsibility. That's what I mean with named responsibility, named ownership. That means that workflows need to be regularly reviewed and, if best, actually be done in such a way by using tooling, by using people to actually make sure that it keeps on improving and it's not just a once improving. And that means that these early signals actually then become not a reactionary force, but become a proactive force. So we can see already what the trend is going to be, trend analytics, which is pretty cool, by the way. You can actually then start forecasting on what's going to happen. You can actually enable the business to enhance, for instance, their customer satisfaction, to actually enhance their pricing models, because you know what's happening out there. You have the early signals, so you know how to change your organization. So healthy process design is vital, but to be honest, healthy processes are not going to happen if you don't have healthy people. Because if your people are swamped, if your people are overworked, if your people are loaded with stress, if your people are being blamed for something they actually should not be blamed for, a classical example, for instance, procurement is always slow. No, procurement takes time because usually most of the time they're waiting for somebody to give them the requirements, but then they get the blame. And most functionaries in the contract lifecycle management space, including procurement, including, for instance, business development, but also people in contract management, are being pressured for speed. But most of the time, they cannot make that speed because they're dependent on usually senior leadership to make decisions, and they don't make decisions. So if you want a healthy process design and you want healthy people, it starts with the fact that senior leaders need to be making decisions, which is something else than having a lot of meetings.
Mm. I like that one.
Yeah, I can imagine you like that one, but this is for me how it's
Yeah.
about.
So if I say you can finish that point off with
Yeah,
accountability and authority, because it, you know, it's what you just said, really.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So I don't
So
know if you want to add anything else to it, but
yeah, accountability without authority is not going to happen. Escalations are late. A human part in this is that if there's a lot of fear in your organization, then people will try to hide and fix things for as long as possible. So that usually means that you, as a leader, actually have the ability to act when it's too late. If there's a culture of openness, transparency, and proactiveness, it means that people are willing to talk about things that are going wrong or seem to be going wrong and have others help them. So again, healthy process, healthy people. And that means that also that this capability itself as a process is not enough. It's humans that are actually doing these things. There's fantastic freaking technology out there that will enable you to capture all kinds of things. But one, somebody needs to tell the technology what it should actually be looking at,
yeah.
validate it and check it. And the other part is is actually, okay, now we have all this cool aggregated information. What are we going to do with it? Because the elements where the bots can talk to each other are usually not the most difficult ones. It's
Mm.
the elements above it that require human interaction, which are vital. And in order to have your people win, they need to be in their power. And they need to be, again, as I said it, they need to be healthy and they need to be enabled and they need to be empowered and they need to have a mandate so they can execute on the expectations.
Yeah, brilliant. Then let me make a couple points around the team isolation, because that's looking at it from slightly different angle, right? Um, because many contract teams are generally strong. And funny enough, at time of recording, I literally just was at an event yesterday and I spoke there, on resilience and burnout prevention, and met so many people with, on the operational coal phase, and it was so interesting to get those insights, right? And they're really strong people, right? Technically capable, right? They understand the work, they know the process, they know where the risks are. I spoke to a health and safety chap yesterday, blimey, right? Like someone mentioned something and knew exactly, this is this clause, we have to do this, that, and the other. So it's not usually a story about people not being good enough. It's more of a story about isolation. So these teams can find themselves cut off from the strategic conversation. They're asked to manage important work, but they're not always given the context that would help them to connect that work to business priorities. They raise the issues, but the issues are heard politely rather than acted on. Exactly what you said, right? They're measured on activity, on throughput, on whether the process is being followed, rather than on whether the organization is actually getting better outcomes. Which comes back to my earlier point, right? Because they're not necessarily seen as, similar to sales. Sales is a revenue function. There we go, right? This is important. And over time, it has a very predictable effect, right? Good people start to quit. Let's just call it out, right? Not because they don't see the problems and not because they do not care, but because experience teaches them that escalation may not change anything. So if a team has learned that raising a concern leads to acknowledgement, but not action, then eventually they stop investing as much energy in speaking up, right? They get tired of, hello, it's me again, there's a problem, right? So they adapt, they cope, they keep things moving, but they bring less insight than they could, right? So you demotivate your team. And that's a huge loss for the organization because the people closest to the work are often the first to see what is going wrong. So if leadership is not hearing them clearly, it's not because the insight isn't there, it's because the environment has taught them that insights will not travel far enough. So the issue is not simply team capability, it's whether leadership has created the conditions where capable people feel connected, heard, and worth listening to. Because when that connection is missing, the organization doesn't just lose information, it loses candor, energy, and early warning. And eventually the team as well, right? And that's a big problem. So let's look a little bit at leadership behavior here, because these behaviors are important because they're not expensive intervention. It's not difficult to be a good leader. They do not require a new system, a major restructure, or a large program. They're management choices, and they change a great deal. So first of all, give people context. If a team understands what matters commercially, operationally, strategically, bring them on board, basically, right? They can make better decisions on the ground. Without context, as I just said, they might be working hard, but they're also working in the dark, basically. With context, they can prioritize the right issues, recognize what is urgent, and connect their day-to-day activity to the bigger picture. Second, back escalation. That means taking it safe and worthwhile for people to raise, making it safe and worthwhile for people to raise concerns early, before they become failures. So too many organizations say they want processes, but then reward silence when things appear stable. So if a team learns that escalation is welcomed only when the problem is already visible, then the organization has missed the moment when intervention was still possible. Backing escalation is what turns warning signals into action. And you heard it here first because you heard it here before. It's psychological safety, right? That's all it is. It should be that simple. Third, measure the impact rather than the activity. So to my point earlier, again, volume can look impressive. People can be busy. Boxes can be ticked. Processes can be followed, right? Reports can be produced, but none of that necessarily tells you whether control is strong. The more useful question is whether the work is reducing risk, protecting value, and improving outcomes. So I would not describe these as soft leadership ideas. I would describe them as practical operating disciplines. They improve judgment because people can see the right context. They improve resilience, right? And I talked about resilience and burnout prevention all the time because problems are surfaced earlier. And they improve control because leadership is measuring what actually matters, not just what is easy to count. So that's the difference between a team that stays busy and a function that genuinely performs, right? So you improve your judgment and your resilience. So that slide was a bit funny because it wasn't a force point. It wasn't a wrong context here. It's more like that's the outcome, right? Because if you improve your judgment and resilience, it's all going to happen. So what this slide really brings together is the central point of the session, right? An integrated model. Very often organizations try to improve performance by choosing one side of the problem. They invest in a team development, better communication, coaching, and capability building. And all of that matters. But if the structure around those people stay unclear, outdated or misaligned, improvement will not hold. Simple as that, right? You can have capable people, committed people, even highly motivated people up. But if they're working inside broken handoffs, weak ownership, unclear authority, or processes that no longer reflect the business, then sooner or later the system will pull performance back down again, right? So from my side, the message is this: people development without structural repair is always going to be partial. Arjen, what's your idea around that from the process side of things?
For me, the process side is about making sure that you have actually the best way to phrase it is an architecture for success. And architecture for success is about terms about groundwork, enablement. Process is an enabler. It's never the goal. Never. Process enables something. So for me, that means that leaders need to understand that they need to have a process to actually do things at scale, repeatable, so they can therefore be proactive and therefore get the maximum out of their human element of the workforce. And therefore, it means that thinking like that is not just process, it's always in connection. You cannot have one and ignore the other. But if you are able to say, listen, I want high performance from my individuals without burning them up, that means I need to give them structure and safety to actually be able to be a high performer. Then the process is actually delivering what it should be delivering for the organization, but also for the people. You won't have the churns, you won't have the redundancies, you won't actually have these missed obligations and all the other small items we talked about. But it needs to be done together.
Yeah. And that's why the title of the webinar, right, is not just a
Yeah,
slogan, right? It's an operating principle.
absolutely. But I also see that a lot of leadership education is not combining these elements, but picking all these elements up as loose buckets. Whilst what we are here doing is kind of more holistic approach and saying, hey, listen, if you're really able to do this 1 + 1, you actually don't get two, you maybe get three, four, or five. Um, and that's the value that what this kind of thinking is bringing you. It's moving something that used to be in the basement and nobody wanted to talk about and nobody didn't care about because the heroes always fixed it, to actually something that's being bringing execution and value creation at scale, because that's what the combination of process, human, and then in the end technology will bring. It will bring you repeatable, predictable value at scale over a long time.
Yeah. And far less dependence on heroics.
Absolutely.
Is what we talked about in the first webinar.
Yes.
So the 90-day reset, Arjun, what should people do?
Well, I think that first and foremost, It's never about going into the ivory tower and create a process. Never. If you start on day one with your people and talk about how should this work and tell us what should be in the process, what do you need from a mandate, what do you need from leadership, you actually can map your reality and then start by creating the zero point 0.1 version of the policy and the process, and then start an iterative approach. And that means that in that iterative approach, you will also find gaps, things that weren't working. Actually, you're going to find that sometimes you want to measure things that you don't have. Then you're also going to find, hey, who is going to take accountability and who's going to take responsibility on what item?
Yeah.
Because usually we tend to mix the two of them up. But process forces you to say who's accountable, who's responsible, what does accountability mean, what does responsibility mean, and that then adds up into the leadership. Because as a leadership, you're always accountable, let's be honest. And
Yeah.
that means that actually you want to be in charge of the review rhythm of this entire process improvement by installing people that actually have the ability to work, that know what they need to do, that know what they're not allowed to do, how to work, but also that they are engaged in improving it. Because if there's one lesson from process improvement, it doesn't matter if you take Lean or Six Sigma or whatever, it's always about talk to the shop floor. There isn't a process book out there, if you take theory of constraints or whatever out there, that says, no, 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 the boardroom knows where the problems are. I love, for instance, there's television shows where CEOs go into the shop floor dressed up as an employee, and what they then see is usually for all of them mind-boggling. And that's the typical proof that the alignment between people and process is not working because all these management layers are all putting in their own reality in there. And therefore, the CEO usually thinks, oh, we're perfectly in control
Mm.
until he goes mystery shopping on the shop floor in his own company. And that's part of the leadership rhythm. If you don't want to be the CEO in a program like Undercover Boss that is surprised, you actually need to have these kind of process improvements based on people input as a mechanism in place where everybody is willing to speak up, nobody hides something, and you actually start capturing the value.
Yeah, brilliant. So last slide. Most people will be happy to hear, right? So really just a short point here on the most dangerous things in organization is that silence is often mistaken for health, right? Just to kind of like, let's summarize this little bit. I know I mentioned that before, but if leaders are not hearing their problem, they, there are no visible escalations, right? If the system appears calm, the natural assumption is that things must be working, but very often it doesn't, right? So sometimes silence just means that somebody or a small group of people is carrying a load that the organization does not see. They're filling gaps, they're chasing people, they're holding details together, they're spotting risks early and managing them quietly. I'm closing the loop here from what I said earlier. They're preventing the issues from surfacing, not because the system is strong, but because they're working incredibly hard to stop the system from failing. And again, this looks impressive from the outside, but it's not a healthy operational model. It's unfair for the people involved because these invisible heroes, right? Usually that comes at a personal cost. And we talked about that in the first webinar. Stress, fatigue, frustration, right? And often a sense that responsibility keeps increasing without support increasing alongside it. Classic scenario for burnout, right? And over time, even very capable people burn out, disengage, or simply stop caring. And it is unsafe for the organization because the system depends on them, right? And you can't build a system based on heroes that are burning out, right? It's like, you know, building a house without a foundation, basically, right? It's fragile. The moment the person carrying that weight leaves, gets overwhelmed, or misses something, the organization suddenly discovers how much was being held together by them. So the leadership challenge here is a simple one. Do not reward hidden heroics by depending on them. If your function looks stable only because good people are absorbing structural weakness, then the answer is not to admire their resilience and move on. The answer is to fix the conditions that make that resilience necessary in the first place. And that leads me on to a question we actually got from someone who couldn't attend today, unfortunately. Um, and I don't know if you remember the question exactly, Arjen, but it was about high performers and what do they do when the process, gets too complicated or isn't working properly. And I think I kind of answered the question here because good people will leave. Good people will not step in as a hero, right? Because they will value their own worth, their own value, if I say above burning out. And so they should, quite frankly, right? So if they don't get the support from the organization, if there's no psychological safety, if they cannot put things forward and improve, I think they will just leave. But I don't know if I understood the question correctly.
Yeah, I
What
think
are your thoughts on that?
I think you're really pushing something here. Let me take it one step further because if you are in a heroic role, being a hero is a fantastic place. You're respected, you get medals, you get honor. It's also addictive. So part
Yeah.
of being a hero is also the addiction of being in a heroic position. And once you start thinking about optimizing the process because you want less heroic but more predictability, the mind shift heroes need to make is the mind shift from running into a house and that's burning and save the child by breaking the windows and running out with the child to
Yeah.
actually make sure that the house doesn't burn down. That's even as heroic in a sense of the word because both will save the life of the child.
Mm,
But one thing is really visible because everybody's watching because the fire truck is in front of the door with the sirens blasting, etc. But to be honest, the amount of collateral damage, even if you save the child, but the house burned down,
mm,
is way more than. But part of it was also why heroics exist, in my opinion, is because people also identify with the organization they work for. So they are proud to fix things for the organization. And the moment you start structuring their work, making it into a process, they might feel undervalued because the company is saying, yeah, we don't need your heroics anymore. But actually, what the company is saying is, we love the fact that you've always been the hero. But let's be honest, there always is more stuff that needs heroics in our organization than we have heroes. So there will always be room for heroism, but instead of that, heroism is going to be unplanned, uncalled, and silently happening. Heroism will transform into an actual decision. When do we need heroics? That means
right.
you still will be a hero. So, yeah,
I
that's
think,
the that's the thing I think we should be talking about and making sure that people understand that by fixing the process, it doesn't mean that we are going to less value them.
no, exactly.
We're actually going to value them because we're now, for once, are going to listen to them and ask them what's really going wrong and how can we do it.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. So before we open it up to the shop floor, and I know we're almost running out of time here, Q&A. But next up, 17th of July, 2 weeks from now, same time, same place, from firefighting to sustainable contract management. So we continue the discussion, go a little bit deeper, and links are all here. And we send the recording of this out. Um, for now, goodbye, and see you in a couple of weeks' time. Cheers.
Enjoy all. Have a great
Yeah.
day.
Let me just stop the recording here.
You did.
I did already.
Yeah.
How did I do that? No,